They talked about my inheritance like I was already gone. We were sitting at my dining table. Same plates, same chairs. Chicken was getting cold. My son leaned back and said, "Well, when Mom's house is sold, that should cover most of it." My daughter-in-law nodded. "We'll need to be smart about the accounts." I was right there, fork in my hand, still breathing. No one raised their voice. No one looked at me. Someone said, "That won't really be her problem anymore." I waited. I thought maybe they'd stop, maybe notice. They didn't. They talked numbers, repairs, timing, like I was a topic, not a person. I cleared my throat. Nobody reacted. That's when it hit me. They weren't being rude. They had already moved on.
Welcome to Life Voices, where family drama turns into late-life justice. Subscribe for more emotional family stories. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from.
After that dinner, something changed. Not in them, in me. The next morning, Rachel was already in my kitchen. She had her laptop open. My mail was stacked beside her. "I organized some things," she said. "Didn't ask first." Mark walked in with coffee. He said, "Good thinking." They talked over me. Not loudly, just enough. Rachel said, "We'll need access to the utility accounts at some point." Mark replied, "Yeah, so nothing slips through the cracks." I said, "Nothing has slipped." Rachel smiled again, that tight smile. "Of course, we're just planning. Planning for me. Without me." Later that week, Mark drove me to the bank. I didn't ask him to. He said, "Just easier if I'm there." The teller asked me a question. Mark answered first. I looked at him. He didn't notice. Rachel leaned closer to the desk and said, "She gets confused with forms sometimes." I didn't correct her. I signed my name anyway, slow, careful. On the drive home, no one spoke. At lunch, they discussed the house again. The guest room, the yard. Rachel said, "It's too much upkeep for one person." I said, "I manage." Mark nodded but kept eating. That nod meant nothing. They started using phrases like, "when the time comes," and "best case scenario." I was still sitting there, still paying taxes, still cooking meals, but they stopped asking my opinion. Rachel began bringing folders. She spread them across my table, insurance, statements, notes in her handwriting. She said, "We're just trying to simplify things for you." I asked, "Who asked for that?" Mark cleared his throat. "She means well." Rachel tapped the papers. "This is how families do it." That sentence stayed with me. A few days later, Rachel replaced the calendar on my fridge. She wrote appointments in her pen. Doctor, dentist, financial review. I hadn't agreed to any of it. Mark said, "It's helpful, Mom. Trust us. Trust us." I noticed my spare room door was open one afternoon. Boxes inside. Rachel stood there holding a tape dispenser. We started clearing some space. "For what?" I asked. She paused, then said, "Later." Later again. My sweaters were folded into a bin. My old photo albums stacked in a corner, nothing thrown away, just moved aside, like me. Mark began calling less. When he did, it was about tasks, appointments, bills, not about how I was sleeping, not about how quiet the house felt. At dinner one night, Rachel said, "We should probably be on the same page." Mark nodded. "Yeah, it'll make things smoother." I asked, "Smoother for who?" Rachel looked surprised, then said, "For everyone." Everyone didn't include me anymore. I stopped correcting small things. I stopped explaining. When Rachel called my neighbor to ask about the fence, I let her. When Mark spoke to my accountant without me, I said nothing. It was easier to watch. One evening, I heard them whispering in the hallway. The door wasn't fully closed. Rachel said, "She doesn't need to know everything." Mark answered, "Right. Less stress." I stood still until they left. That night, I lay in bed awake. The ceiling fan clicked softly. The house felt different. Not angry, not sad, just clear. They didn't hate me. They had already replaced me. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Days passed like that, quiet, organized by someone else. Rachel started bringing groceries without asking, different brands, low salt, low sugar. She said, "We're just being careful." I thanked her, out of habit. Mark stopped asking when I wanted company. He just showed up, sometimes with Rachel, sometimes alone. He'd walk through the house like he was checking something, lights, doors, thermostat. One afternoon he said, "You left the window open upstairs." I said, "I always do." He frowned. "That's not safe." Safe became another word they used often. Rachel talked about safety, about risks, about being realistic. She said, "At our age, things change." Our age. I was older. She wasn't. I started noticing how often they spoke for me. To the pharmacist, to the neighbor, to the repair guy. She prefers afternoons. She doesn't drive much anymore. She forgets details. I drove every day. I remembered everything. But correcting them felt like work, and I was tired. One night, Mark asked if I had thought about options. I asked what kind. He said, "Just in general." Rachel added, "Places with support." Support sounded permanent. I said, "I'm fine." They exchanged a look. Quick, practiced. Mark said, "We're just thinking ahead." Ahead of what? The house grew quieter, not because no one talked, because no one talked to me. They talked around me, about me, past me. I began to answer with fewer words. Yes. Okay, I'll think about it. Rachel seemed relieved. Mark seemed calmer. That's when I understood something important. My resistance made them uncomfortable. My silence made them confident. And confidence, I realized, was exactly what they were building. Not for me, for themselves. It came out by accident. That's the part that still sits heavy with me. I was in the living room, folding laundry. Slow, quiet. The hallway door to the kitchen was half open. I heard Rachel's voice first, low, casual. "Honestly, once the inheritance is settled, things will be easier." I stopped folding. Mark answered, "Yeah, we just need her to cooperate." He said it like he was talking about paperwork, not a person. Rachel laughed softly, not mean, just certain. "She's stubborn, but she'll come around." I held a towel in my hands, didn't move. Mark said, "We can't push too hard, that'll backfire." Rachel replied, "Then we guide it, step by step." Guide it. They thought I was still in the bedroom, or maybe they didn't think about me at all. Mark said, "The lawyer mentioned timing, the sooner the cleaner." Rachel asked, "Do you think she'll question it?" Mark paused. "She trusts me." That one landed hardest. Rachel said, "And if she doesn't?" Mark answered, "Then we remind her we're doing this for her." Silence. Then Rachel said, "Once it's done, everything calms down." I set the towel down, not slammed, just placed it. They weren't angry. They weren't rushed. This wasn't greed spilling out. This was a plan. I stepped back quietly. My knees felt weak. In the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed. They didn't sound guilty. They sounded prepared. I thought about all the times Mark said, "Trust me, Mom." I thought about Rachel saying, "This is how families work." I realized something then. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were waiting for me to stop resisting. A little later, Rachel walked past my door. She smiled when she saw me. "Everything okay?" she asked. I nodded. Mark peeked in. "Need anything?" I shook my head. They both looked relieved. That night, I didn't sleep. Not from fear, from clarity. Because once you hear the truth spoken casually, you can't pretend it was a misunderstanding anymore. And I knew one thing for sure. If I spoke too much, they'd adjust. If I argued, they'd push harder. But if I stayed quiet, they'd show me everything. I stayed in that bedroom longer than I needed to. I could hear them moving around, cabinets opening, water running, normal sounds. That made it worse. When I finally walked out, Rachel was at the counter scrolling on her phone. Mark was rinsing a mug. Rachel looked up. "Oh, good, you're up." Up, like I'd been asleep through something important. Mark said, "We were just talking logistics." Logistics. I nodded and poured myself coffee. My hand didn't shake. Rachel watched me closely, not worried, measuring. She said, "We might stop by the attorney's office next week." I asked, "Why?" Mark answered quickly, "Just to ask questions." Rachel added, "Nothing serious." Nothing serious was their favorite phrase. I took a sip. The coffee tasted the same. They kept talking about schedules, about traffic, like nothing had been said in the kitchen minutes earlier. That's when I understood something else. They assumed I hadn't heard, or that if I had, I wouldn't confront them. And they were right. Not because I was scared, because I was listening now. Later that day, Mark brought up paperwork again. He said, "The lawyer likes when things are organized ahead of time." Rachel said, "It saves stress later." Later always meant after. I asked, "Am I going?" Mark hesitated. "Of course, if you want." If. Rachel smiled. "We'll explain everything." Explain, not discuss. That night, I replayed their words in my head. Once the inheritance is settled, we just need her to cooperate. They hadn't whispered. They hadn't hidden. They spoke like people who believed the outcome was already decided. I thought about all the little changes. The folders, the calendar, the bank visit. It lined up too cleanly to be coincidence. This wasn't about concern. It wasn't about help. It was about control that looked polite. The next morning, Rachel handed me a document. Just one page. She said, "Nothing urgent, just something to look over." I didn't read it right away. Mark said, "No rush." Rush wasn't the point. The point was momentum. They were moving steadily, quietly, and they thought I was standing still. I realized then that reacting would only speed them up. Explaining would give them something to argue with. Anger would make me look unstable. So I did something new. I thanked them. I said, "I appreciate you both." Rachel relaxed. Mark smiled. They thought they'd won something. What they didn't know was this. I had stopped playing the role they expected. And once you do that, the whole plan starts to tilt. They didn't call it that. They never do. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Mark said he'd stop by after work. Rachel came with him. They sat across from me in the living room. Same spot as always. Calm faces, hands folded. Mark started. "Mom, we need to talk about some things." I nodded. Rachel leaned forward a little, not close, just enough. "We've been trying to help," she said. "Help again." Mark said, "And we feel like you're resisting." I asked, "Resisting what?" Rachel answered, "Making things easier." Mark added, "For everyone." They spoke slowly, carefully, like every word had been practiced. Rachel said, "We don't want this to turn into something difficult." There it was. I didn't reply. Mark continued, "This is how families work when someone gets older. Older, not sick, not confused, just older." Rachel said, "You should be grateful we're involved." Grateful. I looked at her, then at Mark. I said, "I didn't ask for management." Mark sighed, not tired, annoyed. "We're not managing," he said. "We're supporting." Rachel nodded. "Exactly." She reached into her bag and placed a folder on the table. Just one. She didn't slide it to me. She placed it in the middle. "This would simplify a lot," she said. I didn't touch it. Mark said, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." That sentence changed the air. Rachel said, "We're trying to protect you from stress." Protect? From what? From myself? I asked. "And if I say no?" They didn't answer right away. Mark said, "Why would you?" Rachel said, "We know what's best." Best for who wasn't said. Mark leaned back. "This isn't about control, Mom." But his tone was firm. Rachel added, "It's about cooperation. Cooperation sounded like obedience. They waited. I felt it then. The pressure. Not loud, not angry, cold. Like they were standing still and expecting me to move. Mark said, "We don't want lawyers involved later." Rachel said, "This keeps things in the family." Family felt like a closed room. I folded my hands in my lap. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just said, "I need time." Rachel's smile faded a little. Mark's jaw tightened. Rachel said, "Of course, but don't wait too long." Mark stood up. "So think about it." They left the folder. They always leave something behind. When the door closed, the house felt very quiet. Not empty, watchful. That was the ultimatum, not spoken directly, but clear enough. I didn't open the folder that night. I left it on the table where Rachel put it, right in the center. I walked past it twice, then 3 times. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't thick, but it felt like it had weight. The next morning, Mark called. Too early for him. "Just checking in," he said. I said, "About what?" A pause. "About yesterday." I told him I was thinking. He said, "Good, just don't overthink." Overthink meant question. Later that day, Rachel texted, "No greeting." "Any questions yet?" I didn't answer. That evening, they came back. Not together this time. Mark first. He sat where he always sat. Didn't look at the folder. He said, "You know we're doing this because we love you." Love sounded like a reason, not a feeling. I asked, "Would you listen if I said no?" He rubbed his hands together. Slow. "Why would you want to make this harder?" Harder again. Later, Rachel came by, alone. She brought muffins, blueberry, my favorite. She placed them on the counter like a peace offering. She said, "I hope you're not upset." I said, "I'm paying attention." She laughed lightly. "See? That's what I mean. You read into things." She pointed at the folder. "We just want to move forward." Forward without me. I asked, "What happens if I don't sign?" Her smile stayed. Her eyes didn't. She said, "Then we'll have to look at other options." Options wasn't explained. She picked up her purse. Paused. "You don't want this to get messy." Messy felt like a warning. After she left, I finally opened the folder. Just enough to see the words, authority, temporary, in best interest. I closed it. Not because I didn't understand, because I did. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks, because the pressure was no longer confusing. It was clear. They weren't asking. They were waiting. And waiting meant they believed time was on their side. They were wrong about one thing. Time was finally on mine. I didn't respond. Not to the texts, not to the calls. I didn't mention the folder. I didn't ask questions. I didn't explain myself. I went quiet. The first day, nothing happened. The second day, Mark called twice. I let it ring. Rachel texted, "Just checking on you." I didn't answer. On the third day, Mark showed up at my door. Unannounced. He stood there longer than usual before knocking again. "Mom," he called. I opened the door. He looked relieved, then confused. "You didn't answer," he said. I nodded. "I didn't have anything to say." He stepped inside, looked around. Everything was the same. Nothing packed, nothing moved. That seemed to bother him. He asked, "Did you look at the papers?" I said, "Yes." "And?" I said nothing. That's when I noticed it. His shoulders tightened, his voice dropped. "Well, what do you think?" I waited. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat. "You know we need to know where you stand." I said, "Do you?" He frowned. Later that night, Rachel called. Her voice was lighter than usual. Too light. "We don't want miscommunication," she said. I listened. Didn't interrupt. She kept talking. About stress, about timing, about being reasonable. When she paused, waiting for me to speak, I didn't. She said, "Linda?" I said, "I'm here." Another pause. "Well, are we okay?" I said, "I'm fine." That wasn't the answer she wanted. After that, the The messages changed, not fewer, more. Mark texted, "Just want to make sure you're not upset." Rachel texted, "We're on the same team." They started explaining things I hadn't asked about: schedules, lawyers, what made sense. They repeated themselves. They filled the silence. That's when I realized something important. That's when I realized silence scared them more than anger. Anger they could label, argue with, manage. Silence gave them nothing to push against. I stayed polite. Short. Yes. No. I'll think about it. Rachel came by with coffee, sat down like nothing was wrong. She talked for 20 minutes straight. I listened. When she finally stopped, she asked, "So?" I smiled and said nothing. Her foot started tapping. Mark asked if I was sick, if I was tired, if I needed space. I said, "I'm just taking my time." Time. That word made them nervous. They started checking in more often, showing up, hovering, not angry, uncertain. And uncertainty made them careless. They talked too much, explained too much. They started trying to fix something that hadn't broken, all because I stopped reacting, all because I stopped performing the role they expected. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I didn't warn. I just watched. And in that quiet space, they began to show their fear. The more I stayed quiet, the louder they became. Mark started calling every morning, same time, before work. "Just checking in," he'd say. I answered once, just once. "I'm fine," I said. He waited for more. I didn't give it. Rachel switched tactics. She sent long messages, paragraphs explaining, reassuring, softening words that didn't need softening. She wrote, "We just want what's best for you. We don't want misunderstandings. We hope you trust us." I didn't respond. A few days later, she showed up again. No coffee this time. She sat on the edge of the chair instead of leaning back. That was new. She said, "You've been distant." I said, "I've been quiet." She smiled, but it slipped fast. "Well, silence can feel like punishment," she said. Punishment. That word told me everything. Mark joined us later. He looked tired. He said, "We're worried." I nodded. Rachel said, "If something's wrong, we can talk." I said, "I know." They waited. Nothing. Mark rubbed his face with his hands. Rachel crossed her arms, then uncrossed them. She said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." There it was again. I asked, "How?" She opened her mouth, closed it. Mark said, "We just don't know what you're thinking." That was the point. I started noticing how quickly they filled gaps. If I paused, they jumped in. If I didn't answer, they explained again. They repeated phrases, like rehearsed lines. "This is for your own good. This is normal. Everyone does this." The longer I stayed calm, the more unsettled they became. Rachel asked if I'd talked to anyone else, friends, a lawyer. I said, "No." That didn't relax her. Mark asked if I was upset with them. I said, "I'm listening." That word bothered him. Listening meant remembering. They started contradicting themselves. Rachel said, "There's no rush." Then, "We really should move forward soon." Mark said, "It's totally your decision." Then, "We just need clarity." Clarity meant compliance. One night, Mark said quietly, "You're being unpredictable." I looked at him. "I've always been quiet," I said. He didn't answer. That's when I knew. They were used to my patience, my explanations, my reassurance. Silence took that away. It forced them to sit with their own intentions. And they didn't like what they felt. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel clever. I felt steady. And steadiness, I learned, was something they couldn't control. I didn't announce anything. I didn't warn them. I didn't explain. I just started doing things quietly. One morning, I drove myself downtown. Same route I'd taken for years. Same parking spot. I didn't tell Mark. I didn't mention it to Rachel. I sat in a small office with beige walls and old magazines on the table. The woman across from me spoke slowly. clearly. She looked at me, not past me. She asked what I wanted, not what my family wanted, what I wanted. That felt strange at first. I answered carefully. I went back 2 more times, always alone. I brought papers from my house, files Rachel had organized, copies Mark thought were already handled. No one rushed me. No one said, "This is best." I made decisions without an audience. At home, I said nothing. When Rachel asked how my day was, I said, "Fine." When Mark asked if I needed a ride, I said, "No." I kept my routines the same grocery store, same walks. They relaxed a little. That told me everything. I signed new documents. Slowly. On my terms. I chose a different person to trust. Someone neutral. Someone paid to listen. I didn't tell Mark what I changed. I didn't tell Rachel anything. I just let them believe everything stayed the same. Rachel stopped hovering. Mark stopped checking in every morning. They thought the silence meant surrender. They mistook calm for agreement. At dinner one night, Rachel said, "I think we're finally on track." Mark smiled. I smiled too. Inside, nothing moved. I watched them settle back into comfort, into assumption. That was the hardest part, letting them feel safe, because safety makes people careless, and careless people reveal what they expect next. I didn't feel sneaky. I felt prepared. I slept better. A full night, finally. Not because I won, because I had space again, and space changes how you breathe. I didn't change how I spoke to them. That was important. Same tone, same small answers. If Rachel asked, "Did you run errands?" I said, "Yes." If Mark asked, "Anything new?" I said, "No." Both were true, just incomplete. I started separating things, not physically at first, mentally. What was mine? What wasn't? I moved my personal papers back into my bedroom, one drawer at a time. Rachel didn't notice, or pretended not to. Mark stopped mentioning the folder. That one stayed on the table, untouched. They took that as a sign. Rachel said one afternoon, "I think we scared you before." She laughed lightly, like it was over. Mark said, "Yeah, we came on too strong." Too strong meant too early. They started acting normal again, friendly, relaxed. Rachel talked about work. Mark complained about traffic. No more urgency. That told me the change was working. I made one more visit just to be sure. I asked questions, specific ones. No one rushed me. No one sighed. I signed the last page and folded my hands. On the way home, I stopped for lunch. Alone. I noticed how quiet my thoughts were. No rehearsing, no defending, just space. That evening, Mark asked if I wanted help with dinner. I said, "I've got it." Rachel smiled. Good. Good meant comfortable. Later, when they left, I stood in the hallway and listened to their car pull away. I didn't feel relief. I felt settled. They thought nothing had changed. That was the point. Because the quietest changes are the ones people don't prepare for. And preparation, I learned, was the real power. A few small things shifted after that. Rachel stopped rearranging my kitchen. The drawers stayed where I put them. Mark stopped asking about appointments. He assumed they were handled. Assumed was good. I noticed how often they finished my sentences before. That stopped too. Not because they respected me more, because they thought the matter was settled. One evening, Rachel said, "I'm glad you're feeling more comfortable now." I didn't ask what she meant. Mark added, "Less tension is better for everyone." Everyone again. I nodded. Inside, I felt steady. Not proud. Not excited. Grounded. I started doing small things just for myself. Longer walks. Lunch with an old friend. I didn't mention any of it. Privacy returned quietly. Like something that had been misplaced and found again. The house felt like mine. They didn't sense the shift. They mistook calm for closure. And I let them. Because once people believe the outcome is secure, they stop watching closely. That's when truth has room to breathe. I wasn't rushing anymore. I had already moved. They just hadn't felt it yet. It happened sooner than I expected. Mark called one evening and asked if we could all sit down. Just to go over a few things, he said. Rachel was already there when I came into the living room. She had that careful posture again, hands folded, back straight. They thought they were ready. Mark cleared his throat. So, we had a follow-up with the lawyer. I waited. Rachel said, and something came up. I didn't move. Mark looked at her, then back at me. There seems to be confusion. Confusion was a safe word. Rachel slid a paper across the table, not the old folder, a new one. This doesn't match what we expected, she said. I picked it up, looked at it once, put it back down. Mark said, "We just need to understand what happened." I said nothing. Rachel leaned forward. Her voice dropped. "This affects plans we already made." Plans? Mark frowned. "Why didn't you tell us?" I looked at him, then at her. Neither of them looked hurt. They looked inconvenienced. Rachel said, "There must be a way to straighten this out." Mark added, "Yeah, we can fix it." Fix it. They spoke faster now, talking over each other, timelines, corrections, calls that could be made. No one said my name. No one asked what I wanted. That's when it became clear. They didn't ask why. They asked how to fix it. The room went quiet after that. Rachel realized what she'd said. Too late. Mark stared at the floor. I stood up slowly. "I'm going to bed," I said. Rachel rushed to stand. "Let's not make this emotional." Emotional? Mark said, "We're just trying to understand." Understand what? That I wasn't gone yet? I turned at the doorway. "I understand," I said. That confused them. I went to my room and closed the door. No slamming, no drama, just a soft click. On the other side, I heard them whispering, urgent, tight. They were afraid now, not of losing me, of losing control. And for the first time, I felt very calm. I didn't come out of my room that night. I could hear them moving around, opening drawers, closing them too hard, Rachel whispered. Mark answered in short bursts, not angry, urgent. The next morning, they acted like nothing happened. Rachel made coffee. Mark read his phone. Too normal. I sat down at the table. They both watched me like they were waiting for a cue. Mark finally said, "We should probably talk about yesterday." I stirred my coffee. Rachel jumped in. There was clearly a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding again. I asked, "About what?" They exchanged a look. Mark said, "The paperwork, the changes." Rachel added, "We just need to know how to move forward." Forward. Always forward. No one said, "Why did you do this?" No one said, "Did we hurt you?" Rachel said, "If this can be reversed, we should act quickly." Reversed. Mark nodded. The lawyers said timing matters. I looked at them, really looked. They weren't worried about me, they were worried about loss. Rachel said, "We've already made assumptions." Mark said, "Plans." Plans again. I said, "You planned without me." Rachel waved her hand lightly. "That's not what this is about." Mark leaned forward. "Mom, this doesn't have to be a big thing." Big thing meant conflict. Rachel said, "We can all sit down and fix this." Fix. I set my spoon down. The sound was small, but it cut through the room. "You keep saying fix," I said, "but you never asked what I wanted." Silence. Rachel opened her mouth, closed it. Mark said, "We assumed." I held up my hand. "That's the problem." They didn't interrupt me then. That was new. I continued. "You talked about my life like it was already settled." Rachel said, "We were trying to help." I nodded. "I know." Mark looked relieved. Too soon. "But help without permission," I said, "is control." Rachel stiffened. Mark said, "That's not fair." Fair. I didn't argue. I said, "You don't need to agree." Rachel asked, "So what happens now?" Now? That was the first honest question they'd asked. I answered, "Now things stay as they are." Mark frowned. "As they are, how?" I looked at him. "As I decided." Rachel leaned back, her arms crossed, not defensive, calculating. She said, "So, what are we supposed to do?" There it was. Not sorry, not reflective, practical. They didn't ask why. They asked how to fix it. That was the reveal. Not of documents, of them. I stood up. "I'm going for a walk," I said. Rachel said, "We're not done." I turned. "I am." I walked out the front door, slow, steady. Behind me, I heard nothing. No footsteps, no calling my name. Just the sound of people realizing they no longer had the final say. I didn't explain myself after that. I didn't send follow-up messages. I didn't clarify. The next few weeks were quiet. Too quiet. Mark called once, short, careful. "Just checking in," he said. I said, "I'm doing well." He waited. I didn't add anything. Rachel didn't call. That told me enough. When we finally sat down again, it was different. Not warm, not hostile, cautious. They asked practical questions about visits, about holidays, no more folders, no more pressure. They avoided certain topics, I noticed. At one point, Mark said, "We don't want to mess things up." Mess things up meant lose access. I nodded. That's wise. They didn't argue. I set boundaries quietly. No explanations, no speeches. What I would discuss, what I wouldn't. What decisions were mine alone. They adjusted. Slowly, reluctantly. Not because they understood, because they had to. Inheritance didn't change them. It revealed them. And it revealed me, too. I wasn't weak. I was patient. I wasn't confused. I was careful. Now my life feels mine again. Calm. Ordered by my own hand. I don't need apologies. I don't need agreement. I need peace. And this time, I chose it.
Your voice matters here. Share your story below. Subscribe for more emotional family stories. Have you ever lived through something similar? Share in the comments. Your voice matters here.